Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Sam's Healing Podcast. My name is Sam. Today, I'm joined by a newly regular contributor to the podcast. His name is Max. He's a betrayed male, and he's a great dude. How are you doing today, my brother?
Great. Enjoying the Florida weather where I'm at, and I understand Texas is treating you well in the same manner right now.
We will take this weather. It's still February. You never know what you're going to get in Texas, but right now we'll take it.
That's right.
On behalf of a lot of men on my podcast, you've been answering some questions and really just trying to make yourself available. What's it been like talking to these guys? And there's lots of women who resonate with your story and your heart. What has that been like for you?
Well, and I love the fact that there are betrayed females to whom this dialogue we're having has appealed, because it just demonstrates the universality of the pain that infidelity causes. It's neither male nor female in some really important ways. That said, there is, as we've discussed in the last two times we've met, a distinctiveness to the betrayed male's pain that is entirely their own. And in both cases, yes, I have been thrilled with the opportunity to engage directly with folks in the comments on those last two conversations. Listen, I know your pain, every dimension of it, every thread of it. I completely get it. And so any questions you've got or anything that you think I might be able to say or share that could help you at least move another inch through that pain, I'm eager to do for you, because I was where you are at now. If in fact you're in a dark place, I know what that felt like. I know how lonely it is. And so to be able to be there for you guys in whatever way I can is a real privilege for me.
I always go back to that time we were sitting in the bar in Tampa, and I just thought, dude, how can I not bring you in regularly? You have so much to give, and you need to give. You know, one of the things that I really believe we need to do, whether we're unfaithful or even whether we're betrayed, is once we start to experience a sense of health and grounding, and that we are able to get our brains back and get our nervous system back, one of the best things that we can do is not launch out into being a coach or being a clinical therapist, but just to help other people who are going through it, because one of the, as you had described, universal themes of infidelity is you just feel so alone.
Oh my gosh. It's the aloneness of it is, as we've talked about, deceptive. We delude ourselves into believing we're alone with our pain. And yet there's an inevitability to the sense that we're alone with our pain, because especially in the immediate aftermath of discovery, we feel severed from all attachment to the world. We do. So yeah, I totally get that. But I'm hopeful that the discussion we're having helps people, gain the kind of eventually groundedness that you're talking about. And as we proceed into this discussion, I had an experience yesterday that I'd like to share on that point when we get to it today.
Absolutely. So today we're talking about, or we're going to talk about, a real touchy subject, but we've never shied away. I've never shied away from touchy subjects. I've always tried to tee them up graciously. So today's not necessarily an episode that I want to warn you about. It's going to be massively triggering, but if we don't talk about this for the betrayed male, we're doing the betrayed male a disservice, because the betrayed male and the betrayed female deals with this as well. So today is a universal conversation, but with the betrayed male, the betrayed deals with the toxic comparison. Yeah. And it's never as prevalent as it is with the man who feels this massive comparison to an affair partner that maybe appeared to be built like this Greek god, or was able to, or in the mind of the betrayed male, thinks he was so much better at making love or what have you. And we feel this immediate shame and humiliation. Did you struggle with that in the comparison world?
That was a tsunami, President Milo, that I struggled with. And I was swept up in this tsunami of that self-shaming comparison to my wife's affair partner. And that went on for a long time. There's no way to rush yourself through this, dude. You just have to lean into it, live with it, find your way through it. And this is a huge piece of what you had to find your way through. Okay, I have a lot to say on this topic. I'm not going to be able to touch on everything in my one response to what you just said, Sam. So feel free to tell me to shut up whenever, and that'll be our way of moving the conversation forward. I'll
Well,
start with.
let me tee it up this way. I want you to start with what you're going to start with, but
Yeah.
You just validated it, which is what I wanted you to do, and to validate the fact
Perfect.
that it was a tsunami, and it had to be something that you never really felt before with such magnitude, right?
No. Oh, 100%. 100%. I've said this in the last two conversations we've had. I never thought this way. I never thought about, I never cultivated thoughts, inclinations, tendencies that could in any way be described as paranoid or jealous or whatever. Because I didn't want to feel that way. I wanted to be secure enough in myself to not be vulnerable to those things. Well, along came infidelity, and that was the end of that.
And that's a great point. The reason that's a great point, and I try and only interrupt guests when it's a real premier moment, but here's why that's important. It's important because on a clinical level, we are always patterning to say, was this a problem before the infidelity? So we've checked that box. But unfortunately, here's what the unhealthy, unfaithful does, which is, well, they were always insecure. They always had doubts. They were always comparing themselves. So you come on and you say, I was never like this before the infidelity, which makes all of us coaches and clinicians heartbreak, because you realize this was not something you struggled with until the infidelity. So before I so rudely interrupt you, continue your thoughts with that as a backdrop.
Please interrupt away. It's your show, and you're great at furthering the conversation along and with those transitions. So I really appreciate it. So I think to maybe turn the corner here on this topic, from what we just discussed to how I found my way through it. One of my favorite, this question of comparison touches on one of my favorite ideas in this space, and one that I know helps to turn my mind toward the real and away from the delusional. Okay. And that was so important in my healing journey. In this, the word comparison is embedded the beginning of the word compete, right? They both start with the same four letters. And I think that's important to chew on, because when you're comparing yourself to your spouse as a affair partner, you are comparing yourself. You're competing with a fantasy. You're competing with something that is not real. You're competing with something that doesn't exist. The affair is a fairy tale. It is a Disney story. It's not real. It's an escape. I remember there was one time when the extent to which a spouse and the spouse's affair partner are infallible in one another's eyes, right? There's no criticism. There's no reality. It's full on 100% inflamed escape from life, from reality. There was one moment I was in a therapy session with a therapist, and I had sort of grumbled about the fact that my spouse would, like, in addition to everything else, go to her affair partner with questions about like cars and like household chores and stuff, whatever. And it always was because this affair partner of hers was the authority on everything now, right? And my therapist said, "Oh yeah, he's great at everything," because you're seeing him through the rose-colored lenses of the fantasy that undergirds this affair. So think about how fair you're being to yourself, how realistic you're being by comparing yourself to your affair partner, no matter what it is, Sam, as you mentioned, a better physique, a better lover, whatever it is. You and I, Sam, have talked about the fact, and you want to get real, and I think it's important to do so. Affair sex is like heroin. You get that dopamine hit, and then you're constantly craving the next one, or constantly planning and calculating to find your way toward the next one. There will come a point, if your spouse leaves you for this affair partner, if they carry this on for years, when reality will intrude on their dynamic. It's inevitable. Think about it this way. 7 years from now, let's say your spouse and his or her affair partner end up, going their own way together. There's going to come a time when a mortgage has to be paid and bills have to be met and trash has to be taken out and dishes have to be done and kids need attention. And reality, those mundane details that the affair strips away to make way for the fantasy, that stuff can't be stripped away for the rest of your life. It's not sustainable. It's always going to be. I'll leave you with this last thought, Sam, that at some point, the fantasy will be met with the wall of resistance that is reality, and then they're gonna have to come to terms with the fact that there is no magic person coming to save us from ourselves. There is no magic person coming to save us from our relationship. Ultimately, it's always up to us and the work required to make it work, to heal ourselves, keep ourselves grounded, and to do what can be done to heal us or the relationship.
Well, we call it the Romeo and Juliet effect, meaning part of the reason it is so much like heroin, but it's not heroin per se that is because the sex is so amazing. It's that the Romeo and Juliet, we shouldn't be doing this. We shouldn't be together.
Yeah.
If we get caught, there's adrenaline, there's dopamine, and then we unfaithful become dopamine addicts where we're just chasing and chasing and chasing. That's why so many unfaithful will have multiple affair partners, because they are chasing dopamine or adrenaline or both. They are looking for some type of jolt to their nervous system because they're unhealthy. Now, you had to be exposed to some pretty traumatic events, and you had an enormous opportunity to ruminate and ruminate. Rumination is when we allow a thought to come and that thought builds on another thought and we just get lost in our thoughts. And we can get lost in our thoughts for hours at a time just ruminating. How did you take your brain back? Because without going into all the specifics, you had an enormous amount of opportunity to let your brain get lost in what you said in the first episode, which was videos and mental images. I mean, you could sit and ruminate for hours if you wanted to. How did you prevent yourself from doing that?
Well, at first I did not. At first I failed abjectly in doing that and ruminated hard.
Like all of us. All of us.
Yeah, it was an S show there for sure at the start. Okay. You are right. At first, that was part of the tsunami too. It was so easy to compare myself against this other person when I didn't even have to do the work of creating those images in my own mind. They were created for me. They were produced for me. Yes, there were videos I discovered. There were text messages I discovered, and adding insult to injury, what were moments when they would speak disparagingly of me together. Okay. And I got wind of some of those remarks between them and stuff like that. So as you say, you're right. I had every occasion to compare myself, to shame myself, to feel like I had to compete with this. But Sam, and you've mentioned your friend Rick Reynolds. There's one thing that he wrote in the materials for an event that I attended, in which he says, you do not bother trying to compete with your affair partner. You can't. It took me a long time to accept that, Sam. It took me a long time to unpack that to the point that I can even understand what it meant to say that it's not something you can compete with because it's not something that's real. All the conditions that you just mentioned with respect to this analogy between a drug habit and affair sex, things like the taboo involved, how they don't have permission to do what they're doing. None of that exists in your marriage. You have all the permission you need to be with one another in any way you wish. So there's just no way to even go about creating those conditions in your marriage or your long-term relationship with your steady, significant other. So, Sam, I would say that the answer to how I was able to halt, for the most part, the rumination that those videos generated in my mind was to work through, unpack, understand, and finally accept and sort of surrender to the fact that it is true that in ruminating to the point that I was comparing myself to this other person, or to the dynamic they enjoyed together, was to compare myself to something that was totally unreal. It was a bubble that enabled them to escape reality. And real relationships like marriages, there is no escaping reality, man. There's a lot of mundane details that you have to live with together from day to day that cannot and never will exist between your spouse and their affair partner, unless, as I just mentioned, they decide to hitch up and go their own way long term, and then they'll know exactly what we're talking about, Sam. It's inevitable.
You had alluded to this, and part of the reason why our drink at the bar necessitated you coming in is because you're in such a good place. You have an opportunity to shred your soon-to-be ex, and you're not doing it. I've known you from the beginning to be a compassionate, kind man with children that you love dearly. And here's the thing that the audience needs to understand. Quite honestly, you still have love in your heart for your ex. And I read this quote on Instagram one day that struck me. It was years ago, and it resurfaces every now and then, but it says, "You've never known pain until you've had to grieve the loss of a person who is still alive."
100%.
How do you process through that? What has helped you? Because there's thousands of men who are having to do the same thing.
I feel if I'm shredding my spouse, as you say, and certainly, I have reasons to do so if I wanted to, right? People would look at my situation from the outside looking in and think, well, of course he's angry. Of course he's lashing out. Of course he's shredding his spouse. I feel powerfully that I would be belittling myself by doing that. How is that productive? What is that? The anger that you're latching onto, the embitterment that you're clinging to by lashing out at your spouse and demonizing and vilifying your spouse, which, by the way, is something you would never want them doing to you. And in I bet a lot of the cases of the folks watching these conversations, that's exactly what happened upon discovery. Is you were blamed. You, the betrayed spouse, were blamed for your unfaithful spouse's actions, right? That didn't feel good, did it? You need to. This is what I don't want to use the second person. Let's use the first person and have me focus on what worked for me, which is focusing on myself, my own healing, and working to cultivate the kind of peace that I desperately needed in the midst of utter and complete, inconceivable chaos. Words fail me when I attempt to describe just how devastating an event the discovery of infidelity is. It is an 8-point on the Richter scale earthquake that completely reduces to not just rubble, but dust all the structures that you took for granted in your life.
You just said it. You cultivated peace. There's betrayed men out there going, yeah, right, pal. What do you mean you cultivated peace? How can I cultivate peace in the middle of an 8-point whatever earthquake? I mean, how did you do that? That seems unreachable.
One great conversation you and I have had were those times when I was not at my best. In some moments when you and I were talking, I was in tears at times. I was awash in self-blame. And this is just one tiny response to what you just said. But for me, it became a powerful thing that I still, as recently as just days ago, was talking to someone about, which is when I am blaming my spouse, vilifying my spouse, whatever, or suspecting my spouse of certain paranoias or judgments or suspicions or whatever. There were more than once, Sam, when you called upon me to think back on my relationship with my mother and think about, my relationship with her and the extent to which I might have been projecting onto my spouse unresolved wounds, traumas, et cetera, associated with a conflicted relationship with my mother, which in some ways is and has been fraught with trauma. And so that helped me understand that this person that I was engaging with in my spouse, projecting my mother onto her was a way of really robbing myself of the ability to see clearly enough to find the peace that I desperately needed. Listen, as I said in our first conversation, or I think last time we spoke, once I figured out that what I needed was not to be my harshest critic, which I was for at least the first 8 months past discovery. I was stubborn with this pain I wanted to hold on to. Once I accepted that what I needed was to self-soothe, and that requires an intentionality that you have to bring to the project of cultivating your peace, soothing yourself. That, yes, is hard to summon in the midst of the indescribable pain that you experience in the aftermath of infidelity. But it's just patting myself on the back about little accomplishments from one day to the next, telling myself loving things, talking to myself, even in the quiet of my own mind, the way a best friend might, the way an ideal loving mother might, mothering yourself, remothering yourself, reparenting yourself. Those are the kind of intentional actions, concrete things that I can do, that you can do, that I had to do, that you must do, in my view, to find your way toward that peace. Yeah, it feels impossible right now, especially if you're right in the aftermath of D-Day. But you owe it to yourself to find a way to become your own best friend. Because, man, the far easier thing to do is to just rip yourself to shreds. And I would argue that by ripping your spouse to shreds, you're also ripping yourself up too. No one wins in that game. You got to find a way to let go of that anger and that embitterment that the discovery of infidelity absolutely generates in your mind and in your life.
You said something a few minutes ago that you had ultimately came to surrender to the fact that this happened. You were a betrayed male. You never really saw it coming until you started to see it coming, and now this was your life. What brought you to a point of surrender? Surrender can also be called powerlessness, where you just you come to a point of acceptance. It sucks. A lot of betrayed men and a lot of betrayed women will kind of push that away, or they'll say, I have accepted it, but they're raging, they're continuing to lash out, or they're in denial. But you talk about that. You just ran through it like it was just another little metric in the whole process. So how did you get to a point of acceptance or surrender, call it powerlessness, to being a betrayed male and all of your unfortunate nightmares coming true in a very short period of time?
A nightmare would have been a luxury, because at least I would have been sleeping. And I didn't do a whole lot of that in the aftermath of infidelity either.
Fair point. Fair point.
Yeah, I would have taken a nightmare over insomnia. The insomnia was the first thing. Then it was the nightmares, waking and dreaming. Okay, for sure. But I had this experience yesterday of you talk about surrender and how I realized I had surrendered, how I found my way to that acceptance of reality. Acceptance of unpleasant reality, and certainly the discovery of infidelity is as unpleasant as it gets, is absolutely indispensable to your healing. The more you try to deny it, you use the verb push and push away, right? Yeah, stuff it down, push it away. Lashing out is another form of denial, in my opinion, right? You're not embracing something when you're lashing out at it. You're resisting it when you're doing that. When you're shredding your spouse, you're resisting reality. You're pushing against it rather than leaning into it and being patient with it. Befriending your pain, as weird and counterintuitive as it sounds, is really important in this process.
Absolutely.
Yesterday, I had this experience of, I mentioned this guy, Matthew Hussey on YouTube before, as we were talking, and he put out this like healing from heartbreak thing yesterday. I saw the opportunity to listen in on this so-called masterclass for free, and I was conflicted about it. I thought, I don't feel like I need that anymore. I did a lot of that in the first year, but right now, but then I thought, let's see how I respond to it now.
Right.
Let's see what, perhaps now that I have a more objective perspective, now that I have, in fact, accepted much of, if not all of the reality that I had to embrace in the aftermath of infidelity, how does it hit me now? Because when I watch your videos, Sam, when I watch, Wayne Baker's videos, when I consumed a blog post after blog post, I did so from a point of complete and utter desperation and helplessness. Okay. So now I'm not consuming this kind of stuff a couple years out. And you know what I discovered about myself yesterday? And for you guys who think you're never going to get past this, I've been as open as I can think to be about my pain, what caused it, all the details of my trauma here in this episode of infidelity that I've had to confront. And I'm telling you, as this person running this heartbreak seminar was doing a great job at the very beginning of making the heartbroken feel heard, making their pain seem to be seen by him. He's lending voice to all of the aspects of heartbreak, and at one point alluding to betrayal as a piece of that. More than once, I laughed out loud in recognition of the things he was saying. The way, the acuteness with which he understood and knew the pain of the heartbroken, and in particular, the pain of the betrayed. For example, one thing he said was, when you're heartbroken, he has a Tai Chi teacher or jiu-jitsu, Brazilian jiu-jitsu teacher. And he said he was even appealing to his jiu-jitsu teacher for advice to get through his heartbreak. And he said, because you'll ask anyone for help when you're going through that.
Yes.
The trash man, whoever it might be, right? And I laughed out loud because that was me, dude. And you repeat the same stories over and over again to whoever will lend an ear to you for 3 minutes. So as he's saying these things, I'm laughing in recognition of myself. Would I have been laughing 12, 18 months ago? Hell no. I would have been awash in tears listening to him talk about that stuff, because I would have felt seen in ways that felt deeply painful to me. But now, guys who think you're not going to get through this, women who have been betrayed and think you're not going to get through this, I'm telling you, you know what I've been through. I've been very open with you. It's been a couple years now, and I was laughing out loud at my own pain yesterday as it was being recounted to me by this expert in the field. And that is, to me, Sam, emblematic of the extent to which I have, in fact, accepted the reality that's behind me in exchange for the luxury of focusing on what is present and what is ahead of me. And that is one giant way in which I found my footing on my healing journey.
And it really is such a good description of finding your footing, because when we are lost in a sea of grief like no other, of pain and betrayal because our person has betrayed us. And one guy described it as a bird with no feet, where you are just constantly flowing, just flying. You can never rest. You can never get your footing. You can never land anywhere. You're just constantly out there. It's a beautiful picture of finding your footing. And how long did it take from, a pretty awful disclosure process and then many trickle truths and drip feeding and multiple disclosures? How long do you think it took before you found not your footing, some footing? How long did it take you, with the work ethic that you had, to find some sense of footing?
Yeah, I love the way you put that, some sense of footing rather than finding your footing. Finding your footing, I don't know that I think I've come a long way in that regard, but I don't know how long it takes to completely find one's footing on a healing journey that originates from such profound trauma as the healing journey that a betrayed spouse must embark upon. But finding some footing, it took a long time even to get to that point. It did. As I said, I would say, and this isn't a prescription for everyone, it's different for each individual, but I would say between 8 to 12 months it took for me to really start gaining this kind of momentum. And one of the reasons for that, Sam, it touches on another thing you just said, which is there will be a day when you're like, oh, wait a minute, I feel okay today, or I feel better today, or I'm able to actually inhale and exhale fully today, and you feel like, okay, maybe I'm making it. Maybe I'm getting somewhere. And then the next day you fall off a cliff and you don't necessarily even know why, but that's what it's like. Your friend Rick Reynolds, again, he tells that story about flying an airplane and not knowing how to do it and then being told to find a star to focus on in the night sky. And that's how you're going to have a constant, stable journey to your destination. But he's absolutely right. If you focus on every wiggle and wobble along your healing journey, it's going to be really tough to get anywhere. But if you just focus on that North Star, which is what I tried to do, you'll get somewhere. But the problem for me was, Sam, I couldn't see any stars in the sky of my life for too long. I mean, 8 to 12 months at least. And my night sky was pitch black. The stars started to emerge when I started to really understand how to accept the reality that was thrust upon me. And once I started to unpack that in the ways that I've tried to discuss here and in the last two episodes we've done together, that's when I started to find some footing. I started to be able to accept reality. I started to be able to understand that comparative thoughts were efforts at comparing myself against something that doesn't exist, an outright and total fantasy. All the things that we're talking about, it took a long time for me to work through them to the point where I could understand them and then start to embrace them. But yeah, I would say it took at least a year just to get to that point.
And that, I want the viewer to both hear, see, and understand. That's with someone who has a pretty fantastic work ethic, who is consuming information, who is not looking for other people to bring them videos or whatever, but is actually doing the work. In my profession, being a coach and helping people, man, if More Unfaithful had the work ethic, this is going to sound really painful to hear, but I know that there will be a reverberation across anybody that hears this. If More Unfaithful had a work ethic of the betrayed, marriages would heal faster. Relationships would heal at lightning quick speed compared to how long it takes, because it just is a picture of, usually the unfaithful has their own black sky, and their black sky is pity and self-hatred, shame, what have you. So, man, I just love doing this with you. We want you to know, both betrayed male and betrayed female, you're watching a relationship between Max and I where we deeply love each other, and I have such a love for him to see how he's healing. And so I'm asking him to come in periodically as his schedule permits to just continue to tell more of his story. And we want you, the betrayed male, to understand, when we do this, there's kind of an inherent wink to you, betrayed male, because there's so little information out there. I have email from all over the world who say, hey, thank you for doing this specifically for the betrayed male. I had a guy reach out the other day and say, the other day you were on a podcast and you corrected someone and you said betrayed female and betrayed male. That made me love you, Sam. And let me just say to you, all over the world, we see you. Max and I see you. We know it's so difficult when you read betrayed female, or when he cheats and it just crushes you. And so we're doing these things because we want to help, but we see you, the betrayed female, but there's a difference for the betrayed male. They feel like they're on this island that's a little bit further beyond the betrayed female's island. And so here's a life preserver. Here's a flare in the sky that we see you. So Max, I love you dearly. I'm so grateful for you taking the time to come in. And if we can help, we'd love for you to follow the podcast and subscribe. Leave a comment. Max will go on and actually answer comments as best he can. If I can help, please reach out to me at samshealingpodcast@gmail.com. If you want to reach Max via email, you don't want to leave a comment, you're maybe concerned about your identity, just email me. I'll push it to Max, and we'll make sure that we get you help. So Max, as always, brother, thank you for coming in, and we will see you next time on Sam's Healing Podcast.